WPF is a really powerful front-end framework. When people start to use it, typically they just scratch the surface of what it can do. Today, we're going to dive a bit deeper into the power of WPF by implementing the MVVM pattern. Specifically, we're going to use Caliburn Micro as our MVVM framework. We could do MVVM on our own, but that feels a bit like building a car before driving it. While both are fun activities, I think it's more important that we learn how to drive before we learn how to build the car. Later, if you feel comfortable and if you really want to do it, you can build your own MVVM framework. Now, if you're new to this channel, my name is Tim Corey and my goal is to make learning C# and other related languages as easy as possible for you. If that sounds good to you, hit the subscribe button to hear all about the videos that I release. If you feel like you might want to go a little bit deeper, there's a link in the description to my mailing list. There you'll get insider news and discounts on the paid courses I provide. All right, so let's jump right into this topic. Let's start off by setting up WPF to use Caliburn Micro. So we'll start by going to Create New Project. We'll select Visual C# Windows Classic Desktop. And here at the very top it says WPF app.NET Framework. So make sure this is the one you have selected, not a different WPF. For example, if you did a search for WPF, we'll find there's multiple project types that use WPF. The one we want is WPF app for the .NET Framework in Visual C#. Now let's call this WPF UI. It's a big acronym, but that's okay. That's the project name. Our solution name, let's call it CM Demo for Caliburn Micro Demo. We'll hit OK. So like I said, we're going to get this set up for MVVM and Caliburn Micro, and then we'll kind of come back and talk about what MVVM actually means, what it stands for, why we do it, and all the rest. But let's start with some basic startup stuff that you need to do. So the first thing, right-click on References and say Manage NuGetd Packages. And the left up here, we'll hit Browse, and then we'll search for Caliburn.micro. There we go. And the very first one up is Caliburn.micro by Rob Eisenberg and all the rest. And the current latest stable version is 3.1.0. So go ahead and install that. We'll ignore the rest of them for now. If you wanted to, there's other kind of add-on projects that will help with different things like Telerik and all the rest. But we just need the Caliburn Micro 3.1.0. And it says, do you want to review these changes? Hit OK before proceeding. That's cool. Let's do it. We've installed. And now if we go to installed, we'll see Caliburn Micro and actually caliburnmicro.core as well. The reason we have two packages is because Caliburn Micro relies on the package of caliburnmicro.core. So with those two installed, we can close that out. And now we need to do a little more housekeeping on our actual application. Out of the gate, we have the app.xaml and the main window.xaml. In app.xaml, it says a startup URI is main window.xaml. So app.xaml says when we start, launch this window. Well, with MVVM and Caliburn Micro, we need to change that. And so the first thing we do is we actually delete main window. Get rid of it. Don't need it. Then in the app.xaml, we take out this line for startup URI. The reason we do is because we're going to have Caliburn Micro handle the startup. We're not going to have WPF handle it. Next, we're going to put a bit of code inside this application.resources. Now, you could just follow along and type this along, or in the description down below, you'll see a link to a blog post where I've put some of these code chunks in place so you can just copy and paste. So we say resource dictionary. And then inside there we say resource dictionary dot merge dictionaries. Inside there we say resource dictionary again. Inside there we say local colon bootstrapper. And then x colon key equals bootstrapper. And so what this is doing is saying, here's where we're going to start our application. In this case, we're going to start it at bootstrapper. Now the thing is, we don't have a bootstrapper yet. Well, we right click on our project and we say add class, and we'll call this bootstrapper. And now we make this public. And we're going to inherit from bootstrapper base. You hit control dot there to add the using statement for Caliburn.micro. And now we have a bootstrapper class. We need to add a couple things here. First, a constructor. I'm going to do a shortcut, CTOR, and tab twice. And say initialize. And then we have one more. We're going to add protected override void on startup. And instead of the base.onStartup, we're going to display root view for, and we're going to need to give it a view model to start. And we'll discuss what view models are in a minute. We don't have a view model yet, but let's call our view model shell view model. And that's kind of like the base or the standard view model to start from, is shell view model. It's kind of like main window.xaml is for the default template. And at this point, you're probably wondering, what are we even doing? We're doing all this stuff. It doesn't seem familiar at all. And that's why there's a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to using Caliburn.micro or even any MVVM framework in WPF. And the reason why is because it does kind of change up how we view the application in the forms. So let's talk through what this is doing, and then we'll go ahead and add our shell view model. So the application starts at the app.xaml. That happens whether using regular WPF or WPF with MVVM using Caliburn Micro. Either way, it happens the same. But if it's a regular WPF app, we specify up here, the line we deleted, is right there, on the next line down, and it said start up our main window.xaml. Well, instead of doing that, we said, since we're using Caliburn Micro, we want to start from the bootstrapper. That's our starting point. And so Caliburn Micro knows how to handle a bootstrapper. That's what it's designed for. That's kind of like the starting point for it. So we created this bootstrapper.cs to say this is the starting point for our application. We inherited from bootstrapper base, which means we bring all that code in from bootstrapper base into our bootstrapper. And while there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that is a lot deeper than what we're dealing with, right now all we care about is two things. First of all, constructor just says initialize, which that's in the bootstrapper base. And so that initialize is going to start up some processes. And then there's an event. And that event is called onStartup. Now we are overriding the base implementation of onStartup. Now, if you're not familiar with overriding, essentially what it does is it says there's a method in, or an event in bootstrapper base called onStartup. But we don't want that code to run. Instead, if the onStartup event gets fired, we want our code to run. And that's where we're overriding that onStartup method. And the only thing we're doing in here is displaying the root view for this view model. So essentially, this is where we're saying this is what to launch. Instead of main window.xaml as our launch point for our MVVM application using Caliburn Micro is the shell view model. So essentially, all the tweaks you've made so far all boil down to launch this view model. That's really all we're doing. Now, we don't have that yet. We're going to create that, but this is a great time to talk about MVVM and what that really means. So let's start by creating a folder for each of the acronyms in MVVM. So say add to the root of our project, add, new folder, models. This is the folder where all of our data objects will live. Now, in MVVM, especially in Caliburn Micro, that's really left up to us when we need models. It's not really baked in the framework. You have to have models like the other two items we're going to talk about. So models, you may have no models, or you may have 100. It really depends on how you deal with data and how you talk to your other parts of your application. So we'll leave that empty for now, and we'll add the next folder, and this is views. So far we have models, the M, the first M in MVVM. Now we have views. So there's the V. So we got M and V. We need VM yet. So views, this is our actual user interface. This is where the objects will live that have XAML, that have that front-end code where we see, text boxes and text blocks and the grid and all the rest. That's where those will live, is inside the views folder. And finally, we add one more folder, and we'll call it view models. And this is the VM. So MVVM. That's the MVVM framework. The view models are really the drivers behind the application. That's where the code lives that supports the views. And so down here in display root view 4, we call a view model. So the shell view model. So the shell view model is going to live inside the view models folder. The shell view will live in the views folder. So if you want to think a little bit simplistically about it, which simplistically is good, think of it in terms of WinForms. In a WinForm application, you have the drag and drop user interface, the front end, we'd call it. Think of that as a view. Then you have the code behind that actually powers that front end. Think of that as the view model. Now, there's some separation concerns going on. There's a little bit more to it than that, but at the base of it, that's really what it is. This is where the code lives. This is where the view lives, or the front end, the user interface. So in our case, we need a shell view model. So right-click on View Models, hit Add, Class, and call it Shell View Model. Now the first thing we need to do is make this public. Now it's up to you, depending on the situation, if you want to inherit from something. And if you go on the Caliburn Micro documentation, there's a few different things you can inherit from. And we can go over those in a little bit, but I want to talk to you about what I do as a common practice. So I typically inherit on the shell view model, which is my kind of base view model, or the foundation. I inherit from screen. I hit Control Dot to add the using Caliburn Micro. And what screen allows is it allows for a little bit more control over opening and closing it. So I can get events to say, hey, we're closing this. Are you sure you want to allow that? And we can use that for something like, if a form had been updated but not yet saved. We could say, hey, do you want to save this form first before closing? So there's some stuff there that that screen allows that's pretty powerful. So I'll start with that, and then as we need it, we may upgrade this to an even more powerful inheritance. But for right now, if we're doing just one view model, then screen is great. And that's all we need to do for our view model. Now we do need to have a corresponding view. So in our views, I'm going to right click and say Add, Window, and I call this Shell View. And I'm actually going to leave this entirely alone. I'm not going to do anything with it yet. So at this point, let's go ahead and hit the Start button. And we get an error. Now, this error is actually 5 different errors. So if we see here, the name Bootstrapper does not exist. Well, yeah, it does. And it's right here, and it's even on the root namespace. So why is that a problem? Well, actually, that's kind of a red herring error. It's not actually the error we want. Down here is the error you want. The shell view model could not be found. That's because I have to do control dot and add the using statement for the view models folder. Now we can run this again, and because this compiles, it will find the Bootstrapper. And it launched the actual application. All right, so we've actually launched our application, and if we expand this out, we see that wpf.ui.viewmodels.shellViewModel is the title up there. So this actually works, and you may be wondering how. How does it work? Because it's calling the shell view model, which is just an empty class. Why is it launching this XAML form? And in fact, you may be wondering, well, is it even launching that form? So let's do this. Just to prove that this is the form that's being launched, the shell view.xaml, let's change the background to red. So this view's background is now red. If I were to start this, and start on the wrong screen, so I'll bring it over, it's red. So it definitely is launching the shell view. Let's get that hideous red off the screen. So how is it launching this view when I said the startup right here on startup was going to launch the shell view model? And that has nothing in it. Doesn't have any reference at all to shell view. And the reason this works is because of naming conventions. So Caliburn Micro is huge on naming conventions. If you name things properly, then they will work together. So in this case, we have a shell view model. It's in the view models folder, and that's important too. Create a view models folder, not VMs, not view model, singular, not my backend code. Always create a view models folder. The same with views and the same with models. That just allows the naming convention to work a little better. Now you can use other folder names if you tell it, but don't rely on that. Do like it's designed for and create these 3 folders. So in the view models folder, I said that the view models are the kind of the back-end code for a user interface. So the actual name is shell. And at the end of it is view model, because that describes what it is, what thing it does, what it represents. So it's a view model. The name is shell. Therefore, if we're looking for the view that corresponds to this, the name will also be shell, but it's something different. It's not a view model, it's a view. It's a shell view. So these, therefore, are connected. This is kind of like the back-end code. This is kind of like the user interface. Now I want to take a real quick digression here and talk about what these 3 folders represent. All 3 folders represent the user interface. This is not a front-end business logic and data access layer. This isn't a 3-layer application. This entire thing is the user interface. It's just the user interface has been further segmented. And that may seem like it's just semantics, but it really is important to note that difference because it changes how you think about the code that goes into the shell view model. It doesn't have to do all the business logic, just the user interface logic. In the WPF add-on course for my C# application from start to finish, where we built Tournament Tracker, and then in the add-on course we actually changed the user interface over to be WPF using this Caliburn Micro, we were just replacing the user interface. We still had our business logic, we still had our data access logic, all inside the class library. The only thing we were replacing was the user interface, even though we had view models, and views. So just keep that in mind, that this is still just a user interface. All right, back off the rabbit trail, back onto MVVM. So this right now is the start of our application. It's working as if we just started up with WPF in a new template. Now let's start actually using Caliburn Micro to see the differences and see the power of it. So let's start off really simple. We're just going to put text on the screen. So let's create a property in our shell view model. We're going to do a full property. So prop full, tab twice, make it a string, and we'll call it, let's call it first name, underscore first name. Tab again, call this first name. All right, so there's our full property. Let's actually make these getters and setters a little prettier. Okay, so there's our full property. It's called first name. It has a get and a set, and that's it. All right, and this is the private backing field. If you're not familiar, the convention is an underscore and then camel case for our name for a private backing field. And what that does, it just lets us know, don't touch this. Don't manipulate it directly. Instead, manipulate the actual property. That way, any kind of filtering that goes on in the get or the set can occur. So that's in our shell view model, the backend code for our user interface. Let's go over to our shell view. Now, in a little bit, we'll set up the grid. Let's just do it now. That way it's a little bit quicker and easier to do. Let's get these out of here. We'll split this the other direction, just so we have a little more visibility into our XAML. All right, so in the grid, you have the grid.column definitions. We'll say the width, and normally what I do is I put a border around, so I'll just say, let's give it a 20 border. And then I copy this and I paste it at the end. So I have on the first and last column have a width of 20. And then the ones inside have auto. I'll just put a few columns in here just to have a few. And the last one I'll do star. So that last one takes up the rest of the space. And if you're not quite familiar with what I'm doing here, on my YouTube channel, there is a video for Intro to WPF. And that's where we talk about the grid and the columns and the rows and setting this all up. So we'll do the same thing, grid.row definition. I'll start with a height of 20 for that first row, and also last row. And then in between, again, we'll do auto for quite a few. The last one we'll do a star. All right. So that just sets up my grid so we have it. I can actually collapse this down so it's a little less space being taken up. And now we can start getting to work on putting something on our page. So let's start with a text block. And we're going to say this is in grid.row, give it row 1, and grid.column, column 1. Column 0 and row 0 are those 20 pixel wide and high borders. And so we'll start inside, kind of like putting a padding around the entire thing. Now, we're used to doing something like this where we say, testing. And it puts testing in a text block, and that's right there on a screen. And let's actually change the font size for this while we're here. So font size equals, let's try 16. Let's do 18. There we go. That's a little more readable for the video. So that's what we're used to, is having just put the value right in the text block. But we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to say x:name equals first name. Sound familiar? We have a first name field or property. Well, the name of this text block is first name. Let's run this and see what happens. Nothing happens. It's empty. Okay? And that's good. That's okay. Let's now go back to our view model and say the first name string, let's initialize it to a value of Tim. And run this again. Now it says Tim on our form. So how did that get there? Well, again, it's naming. So the property is called first name. In here, our text block's name is first name. So what it said was, in the view model, the property lines up with the text box's name. So since the view model is kind of the backing code for this, it said, hey, we've got a match here, connect those two. Now here's the really important part. You need to name things well. First of all, they should be descriptive, which we already know this. But it's even more important since if you call this text box 1, you have to call this text box 1, which makes no sense. Conversely, if you call this text box 1, the only way it links up is if you call this property text box 1. Again, no sense. So name things well. The next thing is make sure that you're consistent and careful in your naming. Meaning, if you call this first name, singular, you can't call this first names, plural. Because then they won't line up. If they don't line up, then it won't connect the two. Then you have a text block with nothing in it. Now, right now, we have a really boring form. It just has a text block that shows something from our view model. And well, that's kind of cool. That's an awful lot of code for just replacing typing in here. So let's make a little more of an interesting item. So let's say text box. I'm going to say grid.row equals 2 and grid.column equals 1. And then I'm going to give it a name of first name. Now, it's going to yell at me because it says the first name is already defined in the scope. So what if I wanted to hook up both a text box and a text block to the same value? Well, they both can't have the same name. Let's take this one's name out for a minute. And now our text box is wired up. We'll get back to the text block in just a minute. But let's add a width of 100 to our text box. And we could say actually here min width instead of width. And that's good because with a minimum width, we say the smallest this text box gets is 100 pixels wide. And the reason why that's important is because if the column were to grow, so would the text box. But at the very minimum, it's going to be 100 wide. So that's good to start with. So before we do anything else, the text block should be empty because it has no name anymore. The text box is named first name, and we'll see that it actually fills it in with the value of Tim, which is great. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and change this form. Go to properties here. Inside of this form, if we look at the Windows startup location, let's change that to center screen. That way it should start on this screen instead of I have to bring it over every time. So that's just a little tweak you can make. So let's shrink that back down. All right, so now it starts center screen. And notice I went to the properties to do this after clicking up here in window, but it just added the XAML right in the screen. So that's really all it does. So I could have just typed out Windows startup location equals center screen. It's just easier sometimes to go to properties and do it. And let's just test it to make sure it's going to work right. So I hit start, and there we go. So it starts on the screen. All right, back to where you were. So we have this text box that now has the first name property, but we want to also have the text block have that same value. So what we can do is we can say text equals, and we'll do a binding. And we'll say path equals first name, comma, mode equals one way. So what this is doing is going to bind to the first name property. Now it's not giving the name of the text box. The text block is not named first name. So that binding doesn't happen automatically through the magic of Caliburn Micro. Instead, we're manually saying this is how you bind it up. And this is what's going on behind the scenes whenever we name something with a name like this. It's looking for that property and saying if there's a property there that's the same name, do this for that item. But you can do it manually if you want. In this case, it's a one-way binding, meaning that it's not going back and forth, meaning it's not also accepting new input and changing the property. So let's run this again. And we'll see we have Tim and Tim, but check this out. Nothing happens. So if I type Timothy, it doesn't change Tim. And that's where we get into the next piece we need to learn, which is the notify if property changed. So we have this full property here, and normally we have auto properties. They're just easier to use or smaller, less code, and it just has a get colon or semicolon set semicolon. It doesn't have the return and the set and the private backing field. But there's some real benefits to having this get and set be a full get and set. And one of them is after you change the value, so it's the set, so after the value is changed, we can say notify of property change, open our parens, open another set of parens and close it, say equals greater than the lambda expression, and say first name. So what is this doing? Well, it's saying notify people, anybody who wants to listen, that the first name property has changed. So really you just need to copy and paste this wherever a property changes, or this changes a value that also changes a property. So for example, we'll get into it in a minute, but if you had a full name property, changing the first name would also change the full name. So you could do a notify of property change on full name as well as first name here. But let's just do first name for now. Let's go back over here and launch the application. And now if I type OTHY, notice my label also updates. Because I changed the value for our property and it notified everybody that the property has changed, it now updates my label with the new value since it's listening for changes. And that's where binding really becomes powerful in Caliburn Micro, because we can bind things together in a way where updates just kind of magically happen. We know it's not magic. We know it's happening, but the conventions really help us out and simplify things a lot. So let's add another property here. We'll do the same thing. In fact, I'm not going to copy and paste. Copy and pasting is dangerous. I don't want to encourage danger. So I'm actually going to do the prop full. And the reason it's dangerous is because I have to change first name, first name, first name, first name, and first name. If I forget, say this first name right here, it would still notify a property change for first name, just not last name. That's a problem. So much better to do a little bit of extra typing, because in the end, it's going to save you some pain. So let's go ahead and in here, so we'll expand out this set. We don't have to expand both of them if you don't want. So we'll say notify of property change, open parens twice, close the first set of parens, put our lambda expression, and say last name. So now it's going to notify of a property change on last name whenever last name has been updated. And finally, I'm going to create one more property, prop full. I'm actually going to take away the private backing field. I'm going to take away the set. I'm going to call this string full name. And it's going to return, and let's do our $ in double quotes. Then inside there we'll do first name space, our curly braces again, last name, like so. So first name space last name is our full name. So we now have this full name property. So let's also have a notify property change in both our first and last name fields that says whenever a value in first name changes, the full name is changed. Whenever a value of last name is changed, the full name is changed. So now we can come back over to our shell view model. We actually can copy and paste these two. Let's just copy and paste the text box. We don't need to have two different text blocks. And we can say this is the last name, and it's in column 2, not column 1. And then for our text block, we'll bind on full name. Now we could just name this, instead of doing the binding, we could just name it x:\name equals full name because nothing else is using full name, but we can leave it this way as well. We can run this now, and now it says Tim is the full name and Tim is the first name because there's nothing in last name but Corey. And now it says Tim space Corey. If I say nope, it's Timothy, now it says Timothy Corey. And there we go. So no matter what you choose in these boxes, this full name is going to update. There we go. Now notice this box keeps getting bigger. The reason why is because the full name is in one column. And as that gets larger, so does the entire column, therefore so is this text box. If you want to change that, what you could do is come over here to your text block and say, we can actually put this on a second line so it's a little more readable. You can say grid.columnSpan equals 2. Now it's going to span both columns here. We start up again. We start typing. And if we say, well, it's Timothy, it goes beyond the border of this particular text box because it spans both of these columns. Now, if you were to really make it big, like this big, it's going to increase the size of this box. Therefore, it's going to increase the size of this column. And if you were to continue to make it bigger, it would make both of them bigger. So see, the dynamic nature of WPF really kind of helps you out in some ways because the text box isn't scrolling off the edge here, unless you want it to. We could say a max size, in which case it would. But without a max size, it just makes the column bigger. And if this gets too big for the 2 columns it's in, it will make the 2 columns bigger. So a lot of flexibility there. And when I'm not specifying you must be this size, then it allows that box to flex depending on the space that it needs. That's a little off topic for this video. That's a little more basics of WPF, but I thought I should point it out since we saw it. All right, so we have 3 different bindings now. We have a binding for first name, one for last name, and one for full name. And just a quick note here, this source code will be available. The final version of it will be available on that blog post as well. So again, the link is in the description. If you want to get the source code of the completed application we built today, then check out that blog post. All right, so let's add one more thing before we continue, and that is we're going to add a combo box. That's probably something else you're going to want to see. It's how we have a list of items and bind that up. So before we move on to a little more advanced topics than this, I want to at least address a combo box. So let's start in our view model. That's the place to start for things. Let's actually kind of crunch this down a bit. So we have a little more space here. You could move this up, this private string up to here if you want, or not, depending on what you feel is necessary. I kind of like to have all the private strings together because it just kind of gives them a home to stay together, and then I know what not to touch, essentially, versus mixing them in between all this. So that's set up. Now we can add a list of items. Well, I want to make this a little more complicated just to show off the full complexity of what you might do. So let's actually go to our Solution Explorer, right-click on Models, and say Add Class, and we'll call this the Person Model. And make it public. And we're going to do a normal model thing. Prop, tab twice. First name. Prop, tab twice. Last name. Really simple, first and last name. That's all we're going to do in this person model. Over here, what I want to do is create a new property, a full property. So prop full. I'm going to create a bindable collection of type person model. Control dot to pull it in using the using statement. And we'll call this underscore people. And I'll start it off with an initial value of new, so it's kind of empty but initialized. Now, since I did the control dot, that messed up my template for the prop full. So I actually have to copy and paste this down to where my var is. I have to change this to be the same type. And I have to change this to be people. All right, so there we go. We have a bindable collection of type person model. Now I know I want to put this into a list of some kind, of combo list or a list box. And so I'm going to create one more full property. I'm going to call this type person model, and we'll call it underscore selected person. There we go. So now this is going to represent one individual person that's been selected. So you choose one person from the list, and that's going to populate this property right here. And so we'll also do a notify property change on this. Oops, one too many. Selected person. There we go. So now we have a notify property change on the selected person whenever it changes. And we can move up this private and this private variable up to there, the backing fields. So now we're a little more compact, a little more neat. There we go. So now you've set up both a bindable collection. Normally it's called a list, but in MVVM we want a bindable collection because it has some more good stuff behind it that allows for notification of changes. So we have a bindable collection of type person model, and we have a selected person of type individual person model, one person model. So that's the back end. Now, normally we'd populate this by, calling a database and loading up the objects and putting them in or something like that. But we're going to simulate calling the database by in the constructor. So let's put constructor here. So CTOR, tab twice. In here, we're actually going to load up people. So we'll say people dot. Notice I'm using the actual property, not the private backing field. People.add new person model. And we'll say first name equals Tim, comma, last name equals Corey. There we go. And we'll copy and paste that line a couple of times. And we'll just change the names. Let's say Bill Jones and Sue Storm. All right, so there we go. Now we have 3 people added to our list at construction of this view model. That's all we really need to do in the back end. Let's change the front end to have a drop down. So I'm going to add here at the end, put a combo box. Now, this is a little cluttered right now. I don't really like cluttered. I like a little more space, a little more rows between things. What I might do is I might make sure that, say, over this one right here, I would put a comment in here, say row 1, and then copy this and paste it down here and say row 2, and so on and so forth. It gives it a little more of a definition or a clarity to where things are instead of kind of crunched together. That also will help me make sure I group things in the same row in the same spot. So it's a little bit easier to look through the source code. It's a little bit easier when you're modifying things and it looks a little nicer. So just something I'd probably do. In fact, I am going to do it here just to make that XAML look a little bit cleaner. Because as you can see, after a while, this crunched up, grouped together, it looks like garbage. It really does. It's hard to read. And that's a problem because this is not just for the compiler to read. This is also for humans to read. And so you need to do everything in your power to make it easily understandable for the next developer to come along. You don't want them spending hours messing around trying to figure out where stuff is or what's happening. Especially since the next developer to come along, it's probably going to be you in 6 months after you've forgotten half of what this does or more. All right, so that's mini lecture over. Let's get back to the combo box. Let's actually start right away with grid.row is in row 3 and grid.column is in column 1. Now we're going to give us a name, and our name is going to be people. That's based upon this property right here. So X. Now notice one thing real quick before we start again. I have this invalid markup right here. Since I went away from this page as I was making this modification, it tried to re-render based upon my changes. And it says, nope, can't do that. So if you go away and you have this problem, you have 2 options. One is the complete, kind of in the dark with this. And the second one is to cut this thing out. It comes back, woohoo. And then you can just paste it right back in and continue on because it won't re-render as you're typing out until you either complete or until you go off the page. So that's just a little side note in case you see that before. So name equals people. So that binds up to the list. But now we need to say where the selected item is. I'll actually put the next line down. So selected item. And we're going to do that binding again. So binding path equals selected person. Mode equals one way to source, meaning it's going to go from this form to the property, not from the property to this form. So you got to think of the directions these are going. This one up here was one way, meaning it pulled from the property, and it kept pulling from the property. It never overwrote the property. This is just the opposite. It overwrites the property. It doesn't read from the property. So it's going just that one direction. And that's what you want. The final thing we need to do, I'll put the next line down here, is the display member path. And what this is the property inside of our class that we want to display in our dropdown. Now we only have first name and last name, so let's choose first name. And we'll close this out. So now we have this dropdown on our form, and this should have 3 people in the list that we can select from. Let's run it real quick and make sure that actually works. It's always good to make sure it compiles. There we go. Tim, Bill, and Sue. How do we know what Bill's last name is? Well, we can actually bind to the selected person model. So let's do that. Let's put in the same row, we'll put a text block, grid.row equals 3, grid.column equals 2. And I'm not worried about padding or anything else like that, margins and all the rest. This is just quick and dirty to show you how to use Caliburn Micro, not how to make a pretty form in WPF. So just to clarify that real quick, because I know this thing is not looking like $1 million right now. And that's okay. It's more about it is all about Caliburn Micro. All right. So grid.row equals 3, grid.column equals 2. And we'll say x:\name equals selected person. But here's the problem. It's not the selected person you want. It's one property out of the selected person. So how do we say I want the last name from the selected person object? Because the selected person is a people model or a person model object. And if we put the whole object there, that won't work. It'll do a toString in that object, and that's just not going to help us. So what we need to do is not dot. That doesn't work. Instead, we have to replace that with an underscore. So underscore last name. So the name of our text block is selected person underscore last name, meaning the selected person property in our shell view model. And then the property inside that is last name. And that's all we need to do. Now let's run this again. And we see nothing over here. But if I select Sue, I get Storm. If I select Bill, I get Jones. And if I select Tim, I get Corey. So we've now bound to that last name property based upon the selected person over in our combo box. Now let's talk about buttons. Now I love the story about buttons in Caliburn Micro. I think they're the most fun thing to play with in the entire package. So let's add a button to our page. So we'll do it in row 4. And we'll say it's on grid.row equals 4 and grid.column equals 1. And for now, we'll just say this is the clear text button. So the idea behind this button is when we click it, it's going to clear the text for both the first and last name fields. So as any text in there, it wipes it out. So let's go over to our shell view model. This is the kind of back-end code again. So I'll collapse down these two extra properties. I'm going to create a new method. And this method is going to have a return a void. So public void, and let's call this the clear text method. And we'll say that it depends on, right now, nothing. Let's just start it off from scratch with nothing, just clear text. That's all it does. And then we're going to say first name equals empty string and last name equals empty string. So when you click that button, it clears out the first and last name properties. So over here, now I call this clear text that has no relation to the actual name clear text. So just to show it doesn't clear names. How about that? But for the button, we're going to say x:name equals clear text. That lines up with our method name. So now if we run this, and let's put a value in this last one, so let's put Corey. If I hit clear names, it all clears out because that is connected to the method by the name. And that's cool. I mean, that's really fun. It's neat. It's easy. It's easy to wire a button up to a method. But there's an even better part to this story. So what if we don't want this button? Let's go back here just a minute. What if we don't want this button to be enabled if there's no screen, there's no text to clear out of the screen? So if we have nothing in the first name or the last name field, why would we ever allow the button to be clicked? Well, we have the idea of a can you click it Boolean. So it would be a public bool can clear text. And that naming is important because it's the clear text, but with can in front of it. And it returns a Boolean, a true or a false. And let's just say for right now, throw new exception. Not implemented exception. How about that? Just so we have that error off the screen. So with this, if we return a false, the button is disabled. If we return a true, the button is enabled. But this button really depends on knowing if the first name and last name fields are populated, because that's how we're going to determine if we can clear the text or not. So the way we determine or link those two up is a couple different ways. One, we could turn this into a property and then say whenever there's a change to the first and last name, notify of property change on the can clear text property. That's one way of doing it. But there's an easier way of doing it. The clear text is going to check the first or relies on the first and last name. So if I pass in first name and last name, now notice I'm using the camel case versus the Pascal case of a property. So a property starts with a capital F, whereas a parameter should start with a lowercase f. But these two match up in other ways. It's just the casing that's different. So since I've matched these two up, it's going to say, well, that's actually going to pull in the first name properties value into this. Now, you may say, well, we don't care because we're not actually going to touch this first and last name, and that's true. If you were to wipe out the value of first and last name instead of this first and last name, wipe these out instead, it wouldn't do anything because these are just temporary or copied values. But because we pass them into the clear text method, we can also pass them into the canClearText method. And now we can say return, and we'll say not string dot is null or white space first name, and is not string is null or white space last name. Now, I don't want to confuse you, so I'm also going to type this out in the full form as well. This is the easy form. Or at least it's an easy form. It's actually an even easier form, which would be to do a lambda expression instead. And I'll show you that first, and then I'll show you the full version as well. So if we copy this and actually comment out these lines, just so we have them for later, but instead do a lambda expression and say that line right there. That will, when you call this method, it's going to return this. This makes it a one-liner. I'm not a huge fan of one-liners just because they are a little harder to read, and hard to read is a problem because code is written for people. So just something to think about, but it is possible, and you may see that in examples. So this is more of a one-liner that's a little more readable. And what it says is return if this is not empty or null, and if this is not empty or null. So let's talk this through. First name, if it has a value, is it empty or null? No. So that would be false. It's not null or empty. But what's not false? True. So if this has a value, it returns true. This portion does. And if this has a value, it would return true in this section right here. So true and true would return true. Yes, you can clear the text. If either of these would be empty, then it would return false, which isn't really what we want. We'd want more of an or. And what that says is, if this has a value, then it returns true. Or if this has a value, it returns true. If neither has a value, it returns false. So that's more what you want. But you see how tricky that was to diagnose and make sure we get right? Honestly, for me, it's just really hard to visualize what this is saying. And so instead, what I typically do is I say something like this. If string dot is, let's actually make that a capital string. Doesn't really matter. It's just convention. You can do lowercase or uppercase for string. So string dot is null or white space first name, and string dot is null or white space last name return false. Else return true. Now, you see how I flipped that script a little bit? Because that can be really tricky. I might not notice it. I might, trying to figure out, okay, not false is true. Again, this is my preference just because for me, it makes it a little easier to be very explicit. And I'd probably even comment this. So if this is null and this is null or empty, return false, meaning you cannot clear the text because they're both empty. Otherwise, one of them at least has a value, therefore return true. So again, I would comment this probably and say exactly what it's doing, but at least there it's a little more clear, a little more straightforward. And yes, just returning false or true out of an if statement, that can be done much simpler in one line, but it might not be as readable. So that's, again, a little rabbit trail, but that's kind of like my best practice, is to make it very, very clear, because if you're reading over this, especially quick, you might get that mixed up, or like I did with the ands and the ors, I got the and mixed up with the or. So just a little easier, but that whole rabbit trail aside, we now have clear text and we have can clear text. They both pass in a first and a last name. since we pass it into the clear text, we can also pass it into the can clear text. We can't, however, delete them from here and just take them in here. So with that being the case, if we start this now, nothing looks like it's changed because we can still clear text. But check this out. If I click this, now even the button is grayed out. But if I type in here, just one letter, all of a sudden this button is ready to go again. Click it. It's now grayed out because it's cleared out. If I type one letter, it comes back. But if I delete that letter, the button is disabled again. So it's a very dynamic, very powerful form that kind of just works on its own. You don't need to tell it all this stuff to do. It really comes down to just whatever this can clear text method says. So it says if it's true or false to enable or disable that button. So that's, I think, one of the more fun things in WPF with Caliburn Micro is those buttons that enable and disable, although the linking and the binding is pretty sweet as well. So far we've talked about one form. Just this one form here. But what if maybe you wanted to have a second form? And that's one of those things where demos often stop. They show you one form, you're like, great, but that doesn't help me in the real world. So let's talk real world for a minute. So let's start by saying we want this. This is kind of the parent view, the shell view. So we want to put inside here and kind of think MDI form, if you're familiar with that, with WinForms, where it's kind of like the parent-child relationship. You have your overall form, then inside there you can have multiple forms displayed. Kind of think of it that way. In this case, we're just going to have one form inside here down below our button. So our button is on row 4, and we have, let's look at the rows. Let's actually expand this out. We have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So row 5 and 6. So we'll actually put on 5 and 6. Let's actually just take out row 6, essentially. So row 5 is that star row. So we're going to say this will be a content control. And we'll say grid.row equals 5. And we'll say that grid.column equals 1. And we'll do a column span. So grid.column span equals 5. I believe there's 5 columns we want to span. Let's give it a name. So we'll say x:name equals active item. And I'll actually put this in the next line down just so we have it down there. And then we'll close it out. So active item is actually going to be a keyword for us that comes right from Caliburn Micro. And that says this is the active form, the active child form. So when you only have one form, it's called active item. And I'll show you what I mean by one form in just a minute. So let's add our comment here, row 5. And so this should live down here. Notice it kind of highlights just a little bit when I mouse over it, saying it's going to be all these boxes right here. So that's our active item. Now let's go back over to our shell view model. And let's actually create 2 methods that will wire up the buttons. And we'll put the buttons back on the front page before we go too much further. But let's create the methods first. So we're going to say public void load. Let's just say load page 1. Normally you wouldn't have something so explicit like load page 1, but in this case it's just a demo. If this is the real world, we could do something like wiring up to the Combobox. So if you click the button, maybe it just says load page or something like that. What would happen is based upon which person was selected, it could load that person's page. We're not going to do that, but that's a possibility. So it wouldn't have to be tied to just one person or one form, It could be tied to any number of forms depending on a selection or some kind of input criteria. But for right now, load page 1, that's all we're going to do. And in here, it's going to say activate item. And right now, there's nothing in my control.list that allows for activate item. That's because we're using this screen as our implementation. We're inheriting from screen. Remember I said at the beginning that that's good for now, but we're going to want to change that. And that's because screen really talks about having just yourself to worry about, just this form. But this form is going to worry about itself and one child. So instead, we're going to inherit from conductor. Now, we have to give it a implementation or an object, a conductor of T it's called. And what we could do here, what some people do, is they say, well, any page that can be brought in as a sub page or a child page has to implement a certain interface. And so you'd say, iScreen or iChild page or something like that. And the interface can be blank. It just has to, all implement that interface. But we're not getting that complicated. We can just say object. Because guess what? Everything inherits from object. Therefore, everything can go into this conductor. So this conductor is going to say you can do this activate item. So now activate item is there. And it says, okay, activate item is going to put that, whatever object you give me, into the conductor. Now, I'm going to leave it empty for right now because I don't have anything to give it. I don't have a form yet. In fact, I'll comment this out just so we don't get yelled at. But let's talk just a minute about this conductor. So if you go to Caliburn Micro's documentation, which is tough sometimes because some of it's old and some of it's really dense as far as it uses words that I'm pretty sure are English, but I'd have to look up their definitions. And it seems like the definitions have to come from a tech manual, not from the dictionary. So it can be kind of tough at times to read through, but they do have a page on the different types of shell view model inheritance. And you can start from screen, something simple. Then there's conductor of object or conductor of T. You can also have one where it says you can have multiple objects and only one is open. Or you can have multiple objects and multiple are open. So there's different options here. We're going to use the simplest. The simplest is you have one object and that's it. One child at a time. So when we ask for a child, it creates the child and puts it in the view. When we change children, meaning we change which child view is there, it's going to first destroy the old child, close it, destroy it, then create the new one and put it in the form. Then when we're done with that, it's going to close and destroy it. With the multiple, it will close them, but not get rid of them. So they are disabled, they're no longer active, they're deactivated, but they're still in the available objects list. And then with a multiple, you can actually have multiple active at the same time. So you can see how it gets a little more complex each time and a little more to work with, but also a little more powerful each time. We don't need all that complexity. We just need one child. That's all we need at a time. So therefore, we're going to do conductor of type object. And we're going to activate one item at a time. So let's come back over to our Solution Explorer and actually create two new view models. So add class, and we'll call this our first child view model. And we'll make it a public class. and we'll inherit this from screen. We'll do control dot for the Caliburn Micro using statement. And we'll do one more. Second child view model. We'll make it public. And we'll inherit from screen. Like I said, screen is kind of like my default for the place I start from for a view model. Now, there's nothing in these two view models, and that's okay. The names aren't great, and that's okay as well. I just want to have two more pages that I can put onto my, or two more, views that I can use as children to my main shell view. So now we need to create the corresponding views for these view models. So right click and say add, and I don't want to add a window. I want to add a user control. User controls are for inside of other windows. They can be used on their own, but they can also be used inside another window. Windows can't be used inside other windows. So that's kind of the difference there. Now there's other differences behind the scenes with WPF, and you can go through all those in a more just WPF-centric course. But for this case, we just need to know that our main view model I set as a window. Everything else I use as a user control. So my first user control will be first child view. Now, this has nothing right now. So let's change the background color to be blue. Simple. Then let's add one more view. So a user control. I'm going to call it second child view. And we'll set this background color to be, let's do green. Not gray. Gray is awful. Green. There we go. It's super bright, but it's definitely recognizable as the second view. So now we can save all this and start closing out the stuff we don't need. Now in our shell view model, when we say activate item, it's really simple. New first child view model. That's it. Now, why new first child view model? Well, we create a new instance of a view model. And since we're activating an item, Caliburn Micro says, okay, that's the view model. Then I know the view must be first child view. And it wires everything up. Let's create one more public void load page 2. And we'll say activate item new second child view model. So we're going to have two buttons, one that says load page 1, one that says load page 2. Each one will activate the corresponding view model. And since we're just activating them, the active view model goes in this active item content control. So that's really all there is to it. So let's just put our button on the form. And in fact, I'm actually going to add that row back in. So I'll copy and paste. I'll put this on row 6, not 5. So I can put the buttons right above it. So I'll say row 5. And in here, let's take this away. I want a button, and the x colon name equals, and that name was going to be load page 1. And I don't really care about the markup, that's fine. And for the actual grid.row, we need to have 5. And for grid.column, we're going to say 1. And we'll call this the load first page button. And then we'll put another button here x:name equals load page 2. Grid.row equals 5. Grid.column equals 2. And we'll say load second page. There we go. And notice how it's squishing off the edge. It'll actually make those columns bigger because of it. So if I hit start now, let's make this a little bigger here. Load first page. Check it out, it's blue. Load second page, now it's green. Also notice, look at the size that it takes up. It seems kind of perfect, right? Well, that's because WPF handles the idea of changes in width really well. We haven't said this is how big you're going to be. Instead, he said take up all the available space in this last row and all the way across, including the last column, except for our nice, neat 20 pixel wide border all the way around. So now we can load different forms on our main form depending on what our needs are. From here, you can make a really powerful application, just the pieces I've shown you. Some people, for example, might say, we're not going to have anything here. We're just going to have these different form views and maybe a menu. So you could select, load people, and it's going to load the people page. And then maybe there's another one that says load tasks, and it loads just the tasks instead. And so the whole page is nothing but child forms. Or other people will say, we're going to have our standard information up here, but then based upon what you select or what you do, different forms will appear and disappear as needed. So there's a ton of stuff you can do with this. If you want to see more of an in-depth on WPF using MVVM and Caliburn Micro, and boy is that a mouthful. But if you want to see more of that, there is the add-on course for my C# application from start to finish course. So I create an add-on course where we use Caliburn Micro to create a new user interface that is a little more powerful, a little more dynamic than our WinForm application was, or WinForm UI was. We replaced that UI with a Caliburn Micro WPF UI that it's a little more powerful, it's a little more fun. And so if you want to see more of a real world application for this or how to use it, that add-on course is probably the best place to go that I can recommend. All right, so I hope that you follow along. I hope that you've kind of kept up with what's going on. You can definitely download the source code from that link in the description on the blog post. You can also leave me a comment down below and say, either I love it, I want to do more, or I'm kind of lost on this, or why would I ever use this? All depends on where it hits for you. So let me know. Also, I appreciate a thumbs up as well if you appreciate the video. Thanks so much. And as always, I am Tim Corey.